Hello everyone. Here we're going to be talking about social comparisons, work hours, and consumption as a social activity. We're going to be taking the model that we looked at in a previous video, in a previous section of the book, and we're going to try to think about some patterns in what people have done in terms of contemporary patterns of work hours in the 20th and 21st centuries. So here's where we're going to start. We're going to start with some data on the number of working hours on average. And what we can see is we've got a variety of countries over here, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. And then we've got Australia, Canada, Japan, and the United States. I'm going to move my head to the side a little bit, and what you can see here is that in these countries, you've got slightly more work hours than in these countries over here in the latter end of the 20th century. But what's interesting over here is that we've seen an increase in the work hours in Sweden, and we've also seen an increase in the United States. And those were happening towards the end of the 20th century. So we've got an increase in work hours in some countries, although on average during the 20th century, work hours have dramatically decreased for most people on average. Okay, so we're thinking about this decrease in work hours up until the year 2000. And what else do we notice? Well, the rate of decline was slower in the United States than in most other countries. And like I've already said, some countries experienced a slight increase, for example, the US and Sweden in the 1980s and 1990s. So just keep those in mind as you're looking at these figures. Now, the thing that we're going to be trying to think about is what could explain that sudden increase as we're going back up? So the reason the decrease makes sense is because as technology becomes more prevalent, as people don't need to engage in certain kinds of work so much, you would think about work hours potentially decreasing as there's been technological transformation. But what we're seeing is at the end of the 20th century, you've got this increase in work hours in Sweden and the United States. And also if we look at some more recent data, which you can find yourselves, you'll be able to see that there are potentially increases in other countries too, for example, the United Kingdom. Now, how can we explain the differences between the countries in our graphs and these changes over time? One of the things that could help explain some of this increase once more is the capacity for social signaling. So what is that? The things we buy to impress ourselves or others are referred to as what we call conspicuous consumption. So I've just put a figure here of an expensive car and an expensive hotel, where we talk to people about the hotel that we stayed at, when we are very loud about everyone can notice the car that we're driving. That is an aspect of what we call conspicuous consumption. Now, what happens here is that we compare our own consumption to that of the very rich. Those people who are conspicuously consuming then affect our consumption, the people who are not as wealthy as the people who are wealthy and conspicuously consuming. So we feel better as our consumption gets closer to the consumption of the wealthy. And so what we do then is we're going to model with an idea called the idea of effective consumption, how adequate our consumption feels to us given what other people consume, given what our neighbors consume, given what people who we consider a reference group of wealthy individuals are consuming. How does our consumption feel relative to theirs? Okay, so when we think about this, we're mathematically going to think about effective consumption is going to be equal to consumption minus the Veblen effect multiplied by the consumption of the rich. So underlying X is the consumption of the rich, V is the Veblen effect, and X is the consumption that someone actually engages in. And so the effective consumption is going to be how that consumption subjectively feels. Now, what's this Veblen thing? Well, Veblen was an economist at the end of the 19th and in the start of the early 20th century, and he wrote a book called The Theory of the Leisure Class in the year 1899. And so when we think about this book, he came up with the idea of conspicuous consumption. So the bigger the Veblen effect, the greater the effect of conspicuous consumption on our consumption. So the conspicuous consumption is the consumption of the wealthy. The greater the effect that their consumption has on ours is captured by V, the size of the Veblen effect. Okay. Now, when we think about this, XV, our effective consumption, is going to be equal to the actual consumption minus V, the Veblen effect, times the consumption of the wealthy. Now, the negative effect of the consumption of the rich is captured by this V. And so Scott, the person who we used in our previous example, his utility function is now going to become his utility of his effective consumption xv raised to the power alpha multiplied by his free time raised to the power 1 minus alpha. So what's his effective consumption? We substitute that in. That's x minus v underline x, all raised to the power alpha. His free time is 1 minus h, where h is his work time, all raised to the 1 minus alpha. Substituting in our values, we know that x is equal to w times h. So that's this over here. X is equal to w times h. So we substitute that back into the function, and we have wh minus vx raised to the power alpha is equal multiplied by 1 minus h raised to the power 1 minus alpha. Okay, now we're going to look at Scott's marginal rate of substitution given this Veblen effect. So when we find his marginal rate of substitution of his free time for consumption, we've found the partial derivative of we found that the two marginal utilities, the partial derivatives of the utility function with respect to x and f. And once we've done that, we can see that we have the ratio of alpha to 1 minus alpha all over 1 minus h over his effective consumption. Then when we substitute the values in for those, I'm just going to erase the circle so we can see here. When we substitute those values in, xv being equal to x minus v underline x, remember that x is equal to wh and v is the Veblen effect and underline x is the consumption of the wealthy, we can see here something about what's going to happen in terms of the consumption of the wealthy in our marginal rate of substitution. So what is that going to do? Well, it's going to say that Scott's level of effective consumption decreases with increased consumption of the rich. Okay, so what that means is that's going to increase his MRS for given consumption and free time. So what does that mean? It means that his indifference curves for a given combination are going to be steeper. So he's going to have to raise consumption in order to compensate for the loss that we're going to observe, the loss of this free time that in terms of that ratio. So in order to compensate for the loss, what is he going to have to do? He's going to have to increase his work time in order to compensate for the loss of that subjective experience of the consequence of the Veblen effect. So let's take a look at what his indifference curves are now going to look like. So I'm going to take the point A, that we had in a previous figure, and with that point A, what are we going to see? We're going to see that at that same point, we've got a steeper indifference curve when we have the indifference curve with a Veblen effect versus the flatter indifference curve when we have the indifference curve without a Veblen effect. So that's the main thing that we want to think about here. Scott's level of effective consumption decreases with increased consumption of the wealthy. So as the wealthy consume more, there's going to increases the MRS, and so it's going to raise the consumption that he'll have to engage in to compensate for the loss as a consequence of this Veblen effect, and increase his work hours. That's what is he going to do as a result? He's going to decrease his leisure time. So with decreasing his leisure time, he's going to have he's basically worked more, less free time in order to consume more. He didn't intrinsically want to consume more. The reason he's having to consume more is because he's compared his consumption to the wealthy, and because of this comparison, he now feels he has to consume more in order to compensate. Therefore, he works more. So for a given allocation, his indifference curves will be steeper compared to when the Veblen effect didn't exist. Okay. So now we've got to bring back in the budget constraint that we had previously, which included his wages. So his wages, what are we going to see here? Well, we've got a new point of tangency. A was the point of tangency without the Veblen effect. B is the point of tangency with the Veblen effect. What do we see happening here? With the Veblen effect, we've got an increase in the consumption, and we've got a decrease in leisure. Exactly what we were suspecting would happen. But what we found is we've had to find the point of tangency. With the point of tangency, what are we going to observe? This point of tangency occurs lower down on the budget constraint, where he is choosing to work more, and as a consequence, he is also consuming more, having worked more. Why? He's taken those wages that he's got from a higher time spent working, and with doing that, what has he done more? He's now gone and consumed more as well. What's all this consumption about? He's compared himself to wealthy. In comparing himself to wealthy, he's worried about his like how good his consumption feels. So what has he done? He's consuming enough to kind of compensate for the loss in terms of his comparison to wealthier individuals. So at this new utility maximum, at point B, less free time, higher consumption. Now, what we want to see here is in our original example, without the Veblen effect, we saw that Scott worked for HA hours, and that was equal to the proportion of hours in his utility function, that fraction alpha. Now what we see is that his hours with the Veblen effect are equal to that same alpha, but plus an additional term over here. That is an extra term which is to do with the effects of the Veblen effect, this comparison to the wealthy individuals in his society. As a result, what do we see Scott doing? He's taken that fraction that we had in the previous example, but now he's increased his work time by an additional amount. So what's happened there is that he's now working more than he did previously, and we're able to capture the degree by which he's working more as captured by this Veblen effect. And so, as we say there, he's going to work 1 minus alpha v underline x divided by w more. So obviously this is just a modeling amount. And so when we're thinking about this, we're trying to instead describe the basic intuitions of why we're seeing people working more in certain societies. So in the United States and Sweden, and also potentially in the United Kingdom. So when we think about that, one thing that could be driving this is inequality between people in societies. And this inequality in people in societies could be driving a social comparison issue between the wealthy and the not as wealthy. And with these social comparisons, people then feel a need to work harder in order to compensate, even though it's not just about their actual levels of consumption.